We go. All right. So thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. We're using the toned gray paper, and we just have three colored pencils that we make this with. So it's the black, brown, and white. And then our gray toned paper serves as, the kind of the base, really. So I'm going to go a little bit closer now. Also, this is 9 by 12 paper, and I have it, portrait wise, or I'm sorry, landscape wise. But you're welcome to turn it around. This is just when I was, I actually made this acorn up. So basically, I was just sketching. And sometimes when I sketch, it turns into a project. So that's why I kind of took up all of this paper you know, without thinking maybe I should, do half of it or whatever. So anyway, let's get started here. And we're going to start first with our pencil. So what we do is we're going to sketch it out first in pencil and then go back and create all the details. So I'm going to give you guys a little more light here. And I'm also going to just straighten out my camera one more time. There we go. And so we're going to start off with the shape. And basically, it is sort of oval-like almost. And you're going to go lighter with with your pencil. I always go darker so you can see it on Zoom. So by lighter, what I mean is, you should be able to see it, but you should also be able to easily erase it if you need to. So starting off with the cap, and basically what I'm doing is I'm just kind of constructing the general shape. And I'm going to give everybody some more time to do this. I just wanted to kind of get that down. There we go. I didn't have the angle right again, so I wanted to kind of fix it. And the trees are just really starting to really blossom here in Pennsylvania with I think with the most recent rain, it seems like that, the trees are just starting to kind of burst with color. So I'm really excited to see them hopefully continue this week. And I've seen lots of acorns. Apparently, this is the year for acorns. I just read this somewhere that I want to say it's like every 5 years, but don't quote me on that. That apparently a lot of acorns are produced. And I have to read up a little more on it because it was sort of like a quick thing that I saw. I don't know if it was probably on Instagram. I follow a bunch of nature stuff. And so it was interesting. I thought, well, great. We're doing an acorn this week. So right on target. So on top of the cap, we also have another part of the acorn here that is this shape. And then we have the stem as well, the part that was connected to the acorn or imaginary acorn here and the tree. So just sort of making an outline of that basic shape. So just take your time. And when you're ready, you're going to connect that cap to the bottom portion. It is a bit oval. with kind of a little knob at the end, like so. And so we're going to start creating the shapes inside the acorn top. So we've done this very lightly so that we are able to now go back in and start adding more detail. You can see right here that we started with sort of the edge. I like to also add a bit more of this section of the acorn. It's kind of, curving outward a little bit. And we're going to have a chance to create, the tile-like sections in the acorn top. And basically, we're going to be adding the details and making parts of it, the lines a little bit more wiggly. So if we look at this, we've got lots of texture happening along the edges. So we want to start creating the tiles, the tile part sections. I kind of call it tiling because it's overlapping on each other. But we want to make sure to have that happen along the outer edge. And then just take note of also, we're going to go back in and we're going to create some texture here along the edges of, that texture that kind of gets broken a little bit, um, from just kind of coming off the tree and getting a little brittle. So that's also going to make our drawing more realistic. So anyway, let's get started now on the overlapping part. So we're going to start up at the top and basically, your shapes don't have to look exactly like mine and you want them to vary in size. And so I start at the top and kind of start to go down the left side as far as the shaping, and just take your time. But as you can see, along this left side of the edge, toward the left, this part here, we also have another part of the shape hanging over to the side. And then here again, you're going to start with the overlapping. And so sometimes, your shape is a little pointed. Basically, as I mentioned, it doesn't have to look exactly like mine, but you definitely want to create shapes that are overlapping and different sizes. So here I'm starting to add some smaller ones. And when I get toward the edge, right, I make it look a little more bumpy. I like to kind of create along the edges first, sort of like on the outside. And so, kind of going down along this right side, kind of creating some of the shapes and then leaving this section to kind of jut out just like on the left side. And so you're going to keep up with that pattern to finish. until we get here towards the bottom. And we want to make sure that we leave space here for this bottom row to be more like a bit more of a line across rather than so much of the overlapping. But when we get to that, I will remind you. So again, continuing to overlap here, adding smaller ones, square type ones, all different sizes. I like to get a little bigger here in the middle with my shapes. And so remember, as we're getting toward the bottom here, we want to leave space for us to kind of go back and create a different texture rather than the overlapping. So just working with what you have here. And then basically when we go back to the edge here, this is where we create some more, um, kind of like that broken texture. Oh, we have somebody coming on in, Deborah. Hi, Deborah. Thanks for joining us. We started, and I'm going to recopy the information in the chat. It's just the materials you need for tonight. Very basic, basic materials: a pencil with an eraser, 3 colored pencils, and the toned paper. No worries at all. It's oh, I'm going to put you on mute because we're recording, but happy that you could join us. So we're using pencil to create the top portion of our acorn. And then we will go back and create the detail with the colored pencils. So you want to try and do this light. And what we're going to do is at the bottom portion of the acorn, we're not going to do that in pencil, the detail part, because at that point, it's line work. And we're just going to use our colored pencils for that. So I'm going to lightly erase some of my pencil work just to lighten it up, since we are going to be covering it using the colored pencils. So that's our next step. And we're actually going to start off with our brown colored pencil. Brown is predominantly in this drawing. So we're going to start off with the brown colored pencil. And basically what's going to happen is we're going to be starting to outline the top portion. But before we do that, we do want to outline the top part, this right here, section that is, was connected to the tree. So we're going to outline that in brown, along with the other sort of knob-like area here. And we're going to add some detail to that, meaning we're going to add some striping, curved striping, like so. And we'll go back and shade that, but for now, we want to do some outlining. And we're also now going to start outlining each section of our kind of tile-like squares here. And then we will take our eraser and erase away the pencil. So again, what we're doing right now is we're using our brown to recreate the shapes of the, hat part. I call it the hat, top of our acorn. And you don't have to, do it really dark as far as when you're retracing, just enough to kind of cover up your pencil. So obviously dark enough to do that, but don't have to press really, really hard. And when we get to the section at the bottom of the hat part, this is where we're going to start to actually press a little harder, because these parts are going to be, there's going to be a shadow underneath. And you do want to use your brown also for the bottom outline of the acorn. And remembering the little nub there as well. And then when you're ready, you can just lightly erase away your pencil. And you should have a bit of an outline of your acorn now. And now is the incredibly fun part. We're going to start with our shading. And so, as I mentioned, your brown is used primarily in this drawing. And we're going to start off with some of the darker shading, which is going to happen right under here on the left side of our acorn. And so right next to it on this section, we're going to shade a little bit darker on the right. And then as we shade to the left, we're going to go a little bit lighter with our shading, and so that it's a bit of a gradient. Later on, we're going to go back and we're going to add a little bit black to that. But for now, we're going to use the brown for shading. And then we're going to basically start shading right underneath here. And so coming right up against the edge of the bottom, we're going to be making those cuts into the bottom portion of the acorns. And you can lightly shade in those sections as well as you're going across. And then we'll do it even a little more underneath. But right now, we just want to get those sections a little bit darker and create, um, the kind of cuts. So for this part, you can go a little bit darker as far as pressure wise with your colored pencil. We're going to go all the way across. And then once you do that, you're going to add some shading right underneath so that there is sort of a shadow. So this is the shadow being cast right underneath the bottom edges of the acorn cap. And just that little bit of shading already starts to kind of transform our drawing here. And then you can start to add a little bit of shading on the top of those sections using both, concentrated shading and then also some singular line work, some strokes by picking up your pencil, your colored pencil on and off. And then I like to add a little bit of a darker area here on the right. And then just outlining again sort of the edge so that the edge of, the part of the acorn cap, it kind of looks like it's lifted up a little bit by going back and doing that. Okay, so we're now going to come up to the top, and where we outlined, we're going to do some shading right underneath the top section of this part right here. And again, very much like a gradient, it's going to be a little bit darker along the edge, and then you're going to fade it out at the bottom. And we're going to leave this section blank without coloring it, because later on we're going to go back in with the white. And so the top section, we add a little bit of some shading on the opposite side of this area, and then also at the top. And that's going to also leave us to this next little sort of oval-like section where we're going to create a little bit more dark as we recreate the curved lines. And we're going to do a bit of some light shading, but going a little bit darker at the bottom. You know, and making sure that those lines are a little darker too. So you want to, you know, press a little more on your colored pencil. Kind of looks like a little pumpkin sitting on top. There is one other little piece here that is sort of the part where, you know, it's kind of broken off a little bit from the tree. I'm going to go really close so you can see that. See that little string-like thing to the right? You want to kind of add that. So we're going to continue shading now each of the sections. And so this is where you do want to start to add a little bit darker pressure right on the bottom of each tile area. So you can see here what I'm doing. I'm outlining the bottom and a little bit of the side of each one. So kind of doing that first. Basically, what would happen is that there would be a bit of a shadow cast on the ones that are sort of layered underneath. And so that's where our shading is going to come into play when we get there. But right now, we can now actually kind of go on the bottom part of each section and just make it a little darker of an outline. And also when you're ready, you can really make a dark outline now on the second part or bottom part of your acorn. And when you get to the, you know, knob part below, you can shade that a little bit dark on the right side. And then, again, just like a gradient, keep it lighter on the right side by not coloring in that section. Maybe just like a little bit of light, um, a little bit, but not much. So the other thing you can do is now along the edge, going back up to the top of the hat. I like to take my brown and start to make the lines along the outer edge a little more bumpy and a little darker. So now adding a little more texture. This is also where sometimes I'll add some more, um, of sort of the tiled parts. Um, I like mine to be a little bit more wider here. So I'm just adding a few more. Just did that now. I'll give you some time, and we're then going to start shading again in each of those tiled areas. Okay, so we're going to now, on each section, we're going to start up at the top. And again, think of it as a gradient, right? So it gets a little bit darker up top, and then it fades out and you go light. Basically, each section of these, we're going to add some white to later on. We're also going to add a little bit of black for the really dark sections. And we also want to add a bit of texture. If you've ever looked at an acorn up close, kind of got, lines inside each of the tiled areas. So I started adding a little bit of line work, light line work, just adding some strokes with your brown colored pencil. So um, we can shade first, and then you can add some of those strokes later if it's easier for you. I tend to kind of do both as I'm going along, but sometimes it's easier to do one, kind of one thing at a time. But like for instance here, I'm just going to start, first adding the shading using strokes. And then I'll go back and make parts of it darker. And also when we add the white later on, actually I think we might add that next. I think that will be helpful, and then we'll go back and make things a little darker with the brown, and then we'll use the black to create the really dark areas. So this already, as you're doing this, should start to look even more realistic. I know it takes a bit of time doing it in each section, but I promise it's worth it. I feel like this is a fun little drawing. You have somebody in your life that loves fall. Maybe it could be a nice gift. Yeah, I sometimes get small with some of mine too, and this one in particular. It is fun to do some of these larger sections. So see, even just with adding the light strokes, it's already looking a bit more realistic. Take your time. I'll give you another maybe 2 minutes, and then we're going to move on to the bottom portion of the acorn and add the brown. So we're doing this in sections, going back with, we're going to add white after that to some of these sections. And then we're going to go back, add a little bit more darker brown, and then finally adding black to some of the really, more pronounced sections. So right now, just adding some light to medium shading on each of the tiled areas. And again, still using the brown. And now we're going to come into the bottom portion and we're going to start very lightly creating line work. And so if you look at my finished one, there is a lot more darker line work going on at the bottom and also towards the top. And then we meet those lines kind of in the middle. So I start off at the top and then go down to the bottom with that line. Curving, you can tell the lines are curving, right? And then as we get towards the middle, they straighten out ever so slightly. And then the lines curve again in the other direction. So I tend to do the lines at first very light and then go back and make them darker. And if you want, if it's easier for you, start up at the top with your line work. And then that will help you with the direction of your lines for the rest of the acorn. So see, now I'm kind of turning my lines, turning the direction. Like so. And then what I like to do is now start at the bottom as far as the shading. And again, shading with strokes going a little darker, and at the same time, literally shading with the pencil toward this bottom section. So I'm stopping and shading a little bit, paying attention toward the right side of the acorn and starting to go up toward the head of the acorn here with the shading. Then starting to basically shade up around the top portion of the acorn a little bit. So very subtle shading. It doesn't have to be in a line because we're going to go back and, add a little more subtle shading. But in order for it to blend as we're going downward, I'm going to go really close now that we are working on a lot of the detail. So you can see how subtle that shading is. And the way that I'm getting it is now I'm just, picking up my, I almost said picking up my brush. I did a lot of teaching of paint today. So picking up my colored pencil and just very lightly, creating these strokes. See, we've just created texture now. You can see I'm skipping spaces, but building up that texture very slowly. And again, concentrating the darker area down below. So as we're doing this, this is especially for Lisa, I'm working on the next large group of programming. And I've had some positive feedback, thank you, on more fine art type stuff like this. So if anybody has a say, because I'm going in that direction, kind of more fine-tuned artwork, some whimsical stuff too. But let me know what you think. We're delving into that this time a bit. I'm testing the waters, but a lot of people seem to like it, so it's really refreshing. So yeah, let me know if you have any ideas, what you'd like to learn. Um, I've had requests for tutorials, um, although I may just add those to my YouTube. But yeah, let me know. But yeah, look how nice and subtle, but yet powerful this is. And then you get a little bit darker, adding some darker lines at the bottom. So going right on top of what you just shaded, adding some darker line work. Also doing it up top as well. Let's not forget about, the top part. So you see that I sort of skip some and then add a dark line. Maybe a dark line in the middle, a few of those. So yeah, this is very much a fine art drawing. I mean, not that, a lot of our other things aren't, but taking a little more time with this in order to build up the values. Um, Let me know if that's your thing, if it's fun for you. Okay. And when you're ready, we're going to add our white. So we're now getting into adding a bit more of the lighter parts. And that's going to look like starting up at the top and in the gray areas, right, of the paper, we're now going to add our white colored pencil in between. So we're adding a bit of light now. And as far as how it goes on each section, it's sort of a scribble so that it also looks a bit textured. So in order to build this up, again, we're going to go back and add a little more brown, a little darker, and then again, finally adding some black. But look at what this white does. Right? It's so fun. Don't worry if you're not as fast as this. I'm going to give you more time. I'm just kind of adding in the lighter areas, but like, see, it really starts to um, make it look more realistic. And then you're also going to take that white and add it in sections in between your brown on the bottom portion as well. And again, you can hear and see I'm doing, strokes of it, picking up the pencil and sort of, almost like scratching the surface. I mean, you're not going to do it as hard to scratch into your paper, but and it's looking pretty good, but we want to add a little more dark when you're ready, but I'll let everybody add the white. You can make some sections a little brighter if you want. I tend to do that here at the top on this section on the left. And you can go back later and even add, some more brighter sections after going back and adding more darks. The other good thing about adding the white, it also adds another dimension by adding another color to our piece. So it adds, when you mix the white with the brown, it adds like a little bit of a light brown. So that's neat too. Um, so when you're ready, You're now going to start adding a little bit more darker shading by pressing, your pencil, the pressure of your pencil a little bit darker. And basically now going sort of on the tops of the ones. Yep, we are still using brown, Lisa. Absolutely. Yeah, we're going back now with our brown to add a little bit more dark. And what we're concentrating on now is having each section, doesn't have to be every single one, but maybe, pick out some that you want to really have, make it look like it's kind of lifting up from underneath. So for instance, here I am right here. And just by adding a little bit of shadow, right, it now looks like it's being kind of lifted up. I do tend to do a lot of them like this, but I don't do all of them because I feel like it might look a little too, I don't know, maybe a little too fake. And at the same time, sometimes I add some darker shading right on top of another tiled area, like right here where there's a shadow, and then I add a little more strokes of shading. Kind of think of it like a tiled roof. Um, I mean, I know we all don't really take a big look at the tiled roof up close once you get up top, but you can kind of see, when the sun is shining on it, you can see the shadows underneath each of those tiles. And that's kind of what we're doing here. We're adding some shadows. You can make certain areas, maybe that are smaller, you can maybe make them even almost, dark. Like I'm doing this section here a little darker. And I like to do the section on the right just a little bit darker up here on the top. And then getting a little darker as we get here toward the right side, and, kind of take a lean back and take a look at this whole area, and you'll see that it's really starting to transform. And then finally going down towards the bottom portion where the nub is and making it a little darker on the right side. We're going to add a little black too, but and then just adding some really dark lines on top of, again, the shaded parts that we already did here. Yeah, and this is still just the brown. And I like to start kind of shading a little around the edges. So on the right side, and then again, a little bit on the left side, but up at the top where again, the hat is kind of sitting on top of the bottom portion. And then again toward the bottom, little darker shading, maybe some darker lines. We'll be going back with black. And this is where you can also just add some subtle details, like again, making a portion of the line a little darker by you know, pressing your colored pencil a little more into the paper, and just making subtle, really subtle lines throughout the rest. And we're going to grab our black when you're ready. And basically, our black is going to really make some of the darkest areas stand out, starting up at the top here, and just going kind of lightly over the brown, but letting the brown still kind of shine through. I also lightly outline the rest of it now in black. So again, what I'm doing is I'm just taking the black and very lightly outlining around the whole acorn. So again, it's very subtle, and then we'll go back and just add a little bit more, um, some darker spots and some darker shading as we put the finishing touches on our acorn. So as you can see, I'm going very lightly. If we take a look at this, there's just very subtle black outline, just enough to make the line darker. Following it down into where the nub is, and then you can really make that nub a little bit darker by using the black to go on top of the brown, just a little bit. And then this is where you're going to start to use the brown, or the black, I'm sorry. You're going to use the black and start to go into the spots that would be a little darker. So for instance, starting here on the left, on top of this big tile area, lightly using your black to shade. And we kind of do that throughout. So again, taking each tile and just adding a little bit of shaded black, and also doing a little outline along the edge toward the bottom of each tile. And it doesn't even have to be each one. It can be, as I did before and said before, every other. So again, if you want to kind of do a little outlining first, and then going back and adding some subtle black shading on top of the brown, not completely covering the brown, just kind of, giving it a little more oomph, if you will. Again, think in a gradient fashion, the black being your darkest shadow, your brown being the next darkest, but a little lighter, and then your white being the brightest part, and obviously the gray tone of the paper is just another sort of medium level, kind of your base. And again, I also add strokes with the black for the shading. It gives it more of a subtle look as well, but at the same time adds a darker shading area. So in some parts, I do kind of concentrate a little more, but for the most part, I kind of add strokes of the black just like we did with the brown and the white. And so here is where you also want to start adding some black underneath where these sections kind of start to, the tiled sections kind of start to lift up, and where the shadow is. Again, subtle shading with the black. And you're going to start to add that black also toward the bottom of the bottom half of the acorn as well. Again, subtle strokes at first, thinking, this would be a little bit darker in this area. And then again, at the top and then toward the bottom. Can't wait to see what these look like. I think these are going to be just fabulous. And if anything gets too dark on you, you can go back in with your white, even with your brown, even with your eraser. You know, um, Eraser does pick up colored pencil. I mean, depending on how dark you add it, but I'll go back and add a little more white. It's so easy to overdo this acorn. So keep that in mind. Give everybody another minute. So I'm just adding some kind of last minute, um, fun uh, kind of cuts into um, the edge part here, the top. So I'm so curious to see what everybody's looks like. So I'm going to remove my spotlight and I will stop the recording. And if you want to show yours, you can go to gallery view. And if you want to unmute, um, and we'll see what these look like. So I'm going to stop the recording now.